So Tim and I are here to talk a bit about dynamic segmentation. So let me first start off with what is dynamic segmentation. It's not any one particular feature. It's actually a collection of different types of features that actually crosses our entire product portfolio, whether that's switching, wireless, or policy. But there's a foundational element to dynamic segmentation, and that's context. So what do I mean by context, right? We can kind of go deep on this, or more importantly, when we get a chance to look at the demo, we can spend a little bit of time looking at each of these different components. But context first starts with things like users and devices, right? Devices could be IoTs, for example. They could be a business device. Really, it's any type of device that connects to a network. And the important thing here is that the network isn't just necessarily wireless, right? We look at the world in the sense that the network can be wired, wireless, or VPN, because the reality is users move all over the place, whether they're statically connected because they're a printer in a building and maybe that printer has to get replaced or moved to a different location, or maybe they're a wireless user like you guys are right now, or you could be remote. You could be sitting in a coffee shop. Now, there's other elements of context that are important to this solution, and here's some examples of them. Things like date and time. These might be elements that we use context to make different decisions about what you can access on the network, whether you're allowed to access the network, and so forth. We also can consider location, as I kind of mentioned, whether you're on-prem or off-prem. We can also consider things like your operating system, right? What type of device that you are, right? This speaks to things like profiling, for example. And last but not least, your identity, right? And identity is also very important because it tells us a lot about you, and it can be information that we've learned natively or information that we've learned from third parties, other types of systems. Now there's two key components to the solution, and they fall into these two categories: policy definition point and a policy enforcement point. So a policy definition point here is ClearPath. So Kirti kind of during the intro talked a little bit about it. It's our policy engine, right? It's a product in our portfolio that I manage as a product manager that provides different types of services from authentication, authorization, third-party integrations, and so forth. But the key thing is it's the central part of our solution in the sense that this is where we're able to create policies and dynamically distribute them throughout the network. So then we kind of shift gears over to the policy enforcement point. Now these could be wireless, could be wired switches, could be that VPN concentrator. And what we do here is that we leverage different features like downloadable roles, a feature that Tim's actually going to demo here in a little bit. And what that means is that ClearPath is able to dynamically push these policies as needed to the actual infrastructure. That makes the solution very easy to use, very scalable, and more importantly, very easy to manage because everything is sort of centralized. So what we're going to go through is 3 use cases as part of our demo. Fingers crossed, Tim has the unfortunate, situation of having agreed to do a demo with me. And so if you've seen some of the keynote demos, some things don't always go according to plan. At least I see a couple smiles. But I trust since Tim's driving and I'm not touching the computer, things will be fine today, but we'll see. We're going to look at 3 use cases, as I mentioned. So the first use case is providing a secure and unified experience regardless of transport. Tim, what might be some things we're going to look at?
Yeah, so the biggest thing is we still have a lot of wired clients on the device, obviously IoT devices, but we still have a large number of our enterprise customers that still have wired desktops, wired laptops. Docking stations are a big one, and being able to provide the same experience, whether they're plugged into the wire, roaming to a wireless network, or then leaving the office and going to Starbucks. That exact same policy, potentially even the same enforcement point, is there. Same network, same firewall policies, all of that, no matter where they are or what they're doing, right? So from a security standpoint and a user experience standpoint, it's incredibly valuable to both the user and the security team.
Now the second use case is really around what we call sort of on-demand application enforcement and visibility, right? There are a lot of solutions out there that do focus on visibility, particularly around applications. But what's key here is that we also have the ability to enforce policies accordingly, right? So we have some capabilities within our WLAN technologies that we've actually now extended to the wired edge as well that lets us go and make really interesting decisions based on, for example, if you're a contractor, whether or not you're allowed to access certain things based on application signatures, not actually like destinations. Tim, anything on that one?
So the big thing is being able to say, a single switch could have this isn't, in our example, it's an 8-port switch, but all of your switches across your campus could have the exact same configuration, and all of that policy is driven based on a decision from ClearPass in this case, right? So, your users that don't necessarily need enhanced visibility, enhanced security, you can keep them at the edge of the network, but then something changes, which we'll demo, some type of quarantine event from a third-party SIM, from one of our firewall integrations. You can then all of a sudden essentially change their access and actually change where they're terminating on the network.
And the last use case that we're going to look at is what we call dynamic and programmatic security operations, right? So one of the key things here is as networks have changed and as use cases have changed, a lot of people are no longer wanting to jump onto the individual vendor's product. They want to orchestrate externally, right? They want to also be able to leverage information from our products with others. So what Tim's actually going to be able to show is how we leverage APIs to do that. He's actually built an application specifically for this event to show.
So the big thing is ClearPass has been, to be honest, like a very interesting product for Aruba. It was really the first product that touched multiple teams in an organization. Sometimes it's sold to the security team, sometimes it's sold to the network team. It's whoever really owns it in that organization. So it's an interesting internal battle sometimes of who owns that access to that, who changes configurations and other things. And in many cases, the network team owns kind of the base install of ClearPass. And we have the ability through the REST APIs to essentially give a security analyst the tools they need, which are more operational, which is getting a device on the network, getting it off the network, revoking certificates and credentials, right? Those are typical roles of a security analyst in terms of a day-to-day operation.
All right. Now, as Tim is making sure everything's still working, I'm just going to give you a quick little overview on topology. Now, obviously, we didn't cart over an 8400 core switch on this table. This happens to be our campus on a table, I guess is what we'll call it. But basically, to kind of give you some ideas as to what this might look like, obviously, you've got some networking going on. We have our controllers, which happens to be, I think, sitting on the floor, actually. We're going to be able to demonstrate kind of a wireless scenario. We'll also demonstrate a wired scenario as well. Now, just in the interest of time, we don't have a VPN example. But again, we're leveraging all the same techniques of dynamic segmentation to kind of show how that user experience can kind of go across regardless of your transport. Ready?
Yeah, and if you're not familiar with the VIA client, the nice thing is that is can have the same termination point as your wired switching. It could have separate controllers in your DMZ, whatever, but it's the same architecture, same role enforcement point. So you're literally getting that, what we've typically called colorless ports. I think those days are going away where there was a voice port and a...
Let's be fair, I had to teach you what a colorless port was. You said, what do you mean? There was offices that had colored ports? So
that's true. Yeah. It is true. So we're distancing ourselves from that term because it's a great way to explain it, but a lot of people don't even remember that anymore. But essentially that experience of it not mattering which port you're plugging into, whether it's even worrying about what VPN concentrator you're connected to, you're getting that same access when you leave the premise, and also the ability for the VIA client, for example, to do basic detection to determine automatically that you're off premise and connect you to the appropriate infrastructure.
That was the politest way of saying that I'm old when I talk about wired ports that are colors, right? Okay.
Well, you were the switch PLMs.
That is true. All right, so let's see, fingers crossed. I will stay away from your computer, and let's go ahead and...
So my lab isn't working, so I'm going to have to apologize if it's a little slower.
We're off to a great start.
Yeah. All right. All right, cool. All right, so as Madani mentioned, this is what I would call a campus in a box, right? 8-port switch. Generally, you wouldn't have that in your enterprise, but it's a smaller version. We have a traditional VoIP phone, right? That is very common still in large enterprises, a desktop phone. We have down here a couple of clients and a wireless AP and a controller, right? So as we saw on that slide, a somewhat typical environment. And we want to show, right, in this example, we have a Windows 10 client. Let's swipe here. It is currently connected wired, and it's doing .1x. In this case, it's using a machine credential, for example. That could be a certificate, obviously. And what we want to show is when I unplug that and connect to the wireless network, the exact same access role, same network, same firewall policy, et cetera. So what I'm going to do is just quickly show the controller, right? If we look on our controller dashboard, we actually click on the wired side, we'll actually see that this is the wired client with its traffic terminating at the controller. And the way this architecture works, kind of to get into the technical details, right, is the switch maintains full control over the AAA session, right? So the switch is authenticating the user. It's responsible for disconnecting the user from the network, but we've moved the data termination point and enforcement point up to the controller. And that's all dynamic based on the device type. And we'll show kind of the difference between a local user and a tunneled user in a second. So in this case, like I said, it's wireless. It's a wired user. You'll see role managed device, right? So we've determined that this is actually a a wired machine auth, right? This is a corporate asset.
So Tim, how exactly do we figure out this role exactly?
Yeah, so in our policy, right, this is a very basic policy, but ClearPass, to simplify ClearPass down, obviously policy is a fairly complex thing, but ClearPass is a giant context if this then that statement, right? That is the goal, right? We consume context from third parties, from our own infrastructure. We use our network as a sensor to pull in fingerprinting data, for example, from our switching and our controllers. But ultimately, it's a giant if-then statement to say, combine a user and a device context into a final access role. And I say final very loosely, right, because the power is being able to change that access role at any time. So if we just take a quick look, we were able to determine this was the user down here, right, wired machine auth. And in this case, our enforcement level, because we were a machine auth, we were able to say, return a role that actually tunnels this to a controller and gives it the managed device role. So you'll see managed device, and that is actually the role that's assigned here on the controller. Now, if I were to disconnect the wired side, let's make sure I do the right one here. And I'm going to go ahead and click connect. Oh, there's a nice GUI bug. There we go. I'm going to go ahead and click connect. And we're connected now. And if I actually shoot back over to the controller, you'll notice the wired client is gone. And I see the exact same client with the exact same access role connected to the wireless network. Right? So from an end user, the biggest use case we run into where this is really a big issue, or traditionally has been, is a docking station. Right? The docking station experience, whether it's a traditional docking station that has a docking connector, or now everyone has USB-C docks with a wired interface, it was typically a very challenging thing because you end up in a different network. Maybe you end up in a role that a temporary role until the network figures out who you are. It's a very seamless experience, and all of that policy is enforced there.
So how does your product identify the users on that device? You just mentioned the laptop with a docking station and Wi-Fi. That's 3 MAC addresses.
Sure.
And on the other tab, I saw you can have different sources for identity.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So you can still hook into Active Directory, for instance?
Absolutely, yeah. So what we're seeing is we've always kind of had Active Directory and LDAP. We're seeing a lot more migration towards Azure AD, Google Cloud Identity, Octoping, all those guys. And essentially what we're seeing is a transition from what I would consider kind of a legacy authentication methods like PEEP, which are, have their known security vulnerabilities, over to TLS. And whether that's a machine identity plus user identity, one certificate that is bound to the device that is in the user's name, right? There's obviously different combinations there. And then really the identity store comes into play for authorization.
Is there a token on the user's device as well?
A hardware token?
No, like a software token from, like if it was an Azure AD
Or a certificate.
Certificate.
So generally, so for Azure Modern Manager or like Windows Modern Management, generally you're going to deploy Azure AD with certificates via Intune. Intune's kind of the modern group policy, right? So that would be issued directly from Intune, and we have an integration with Intune to then pull down authorization data that can link those together. So there's like, one of the things with ClearPass is you can deploy it 100 different ways.
What about Chromebooks?
Chromebooks, yeah. So we actually have an integration with Google. We work very closely with Google. I'm heading there in 2 hours. And we actually have a full native enrollment with the ClearPass PKI. So ClearPass has a built-in PKI. The goal is for it to be really, really simple for, most folks generally don't understand a PKI or can maintain it. So it's really meant to be that end user set it, admin set it up and go. And we have a direct integration with Google Cloud Management and that. So we can install a system or a user level certificate on the device.
I might add one point, just to be clear. So, this example, putting a certificate on the device, there's no special software that's needed on the client side, right? There are instances where customers have put client software on there, mainly to give additional context, right? So sometimes there's some endpoint compliance software where they want us to use that as an authorization source. But the workflows that you're seeing didn't require us to do anything special with the end devices themselves.
Yeah, this Windows 10 client is vanilla out of the box after some updates. Yeah, and I think the big point is, right, all of those type of authorization and context pieces are enabled by our integration framework. So we really have 2 integration frameworks, and we've kind of been leaning towards one over the other. And the reason for that is we've had a lot of integrations over the years that were baked into the product. They were in the code. Every time we released a release, you got some new functionality. What we did was we enabled a new functionality. It's not new anymore. It feels like it's new still. So it's been a couple of years. We have ClearPass extensions, we call it. And think of it almost like a browser extension, right? It runs independently from the browser, and we're able to deploy integrations much faster as they change. Because what was happening as people were moving, let's use AirWatch as an example, from AirWatch on-prem to AirWatch Cloud, the cloud APIs get updated much quicker than you upgrading your AirWatch on-prem. So what we're running into, to be frank, is we were struggling to get those changes into the code. Now we have the ability to push those changes nearly instantly.
If you could put this in like the term, if you could model this for me like we used to have with Radius and applicant or supplicant
Sure.
802.11x.
Yep.
ClearPass is up here, the switch is down here, and then ClearPass is connecting to AD. Is it kind of playing the role of
Yeah, so
Radius?
essentially, so all the network infrastructure is speaking Radius or RadSec, right? Essentially the same idea, one's more secure. And ClearPass is then talking to all these other sources.
Okay.
Right, so essentially, and that's really where I think the certificate versus token versus application is important, right? We want a strong credential from the client or user to prove who they are, and then we can calculate all the context from there, right? We don't necessarily want to be calculating an authorization rule based on the properties of a certificate, because that is at the time of certificate issuance, right? So we want to go to Intune or Azure and say, what is the current user of the state now? Which we've always had with AD, but obviously over the years it became a little bit more challenging when everything's in the cloud.
I think, when you think about Radius originally, when it was being used in these types of applications, it was very much permit and deny, right? Are you allowed on or are you not, just based on the auth source. And I think what we've sort of repositioned is we use Radius as just a means for communication. We're going to leverage the actual context from a much larger variety of sources and then use it as part of that policy, right? So, in this particular example where we saw the same role was applied, right? That shows that the experience is the same, but let's say you actually don't want the experience to be the same. Even though the device hasn't changed, the certificate hasn't changed, maybe we did want it to be that if you're on wireless, you're able to access ABC applications, but if you're on wired, you're only able to access application A, right? And so in that instance, what we're using is how did you connect to the network, right, to make that type of policy decision. Back to the whole if this, then kind of architecture.
I want my users to have to manage as few passwords as possible, so I like the single sign-on app intent here.
Absolutely.
And if you could do it across Chromebooks as well, and Macs, I'm assuming?
Absolutely. So generally on the Mac, we rely on an EMM provider, which traditionally was different than Windows, but now that Windows 10 is really cloud managed first, everything kind of runs some form of EMM, whether it's agent.
What's EMM?
Enterprise Mobility Management.
Oh,
so
okay.
AirWatch, VMware. It was traditionally AirWatch, Mobile Iron, those players, but now you have Intune. Google has their own solution for managing Chromebooks. So, and that's really where we pride ourselves, is really taking the time to integrate with all those platforms, because we don't necessarily want to be an MDM or an EMM, right?
Yeah. Thank you.
Sure.
Want to jump to the second use case?
Yeah, let's do the second one.
We've shown a lot of the
So we showed kind of a wired and wireless user moving back and forth between, 5 minutes, really? Good question. So we showed the wired and the wireless user going back and forth. What I did want to show was, as I mentioned, there are still a lot of large enterprise customers that have VoIP phones, and they've always been an interesting device on the network because of the fact that you can bridge out the back to a client. So I wanted to show the power of the decision making for user-based testing, is that we can keep the phone local, right? Our switches have all of the QoS capabilities to handle the voice traffic, because a typical voice phone is very predictable versus something like Teams, Skype, Slack on your laptop. So this is very predictable. We can have a QoS policy. So what I want to do is keep this phone local, which it is now, and I'll just show you that real quick. If I look at the switches user table, we'll actually see.
Want to bump it up a little? Table's probably blocked.
I can't easily zoom it, so I apologize. I see what you're saying. Yeah, sorry.
Hey, that's better.
There we go. All right, so this is a voice device connected to port 1. There it is. It is a local role. You'll notice that it's actually using a local VLAN, so that's a VLAN defined on the switch. In this case, it actually downloaded the role from ClearPass. And I just want to pause on that real quick, because I think it's important to cover here.
Are you using that as a MAB object?
Sorry?
Are you using that as a MAB object?
Yes, in that case, right? So a lot of newer phones do come with a factory certificate. So fun fact, all Aruba APs, for example, come with a factory certificate burned into TPM. And you can actually essentially take an Aruba AP out of the box and do full .1x to the network. We could fall back to Mac auth for provisioning, for example.
Sure. I rarely see anyone with a new phone system, so
right.
that is lots and lots of
usually
MABs.
It's on the way out, if that's the case.
Yeah. 20 years.
So real quick, I just wanted to show the interface for creating policy, right? Because ultimately the days of going to each individual switch, even going to your wireless controllers and building policy with dynamic segmentation kind of go away, right? So if I create a Aruba switch policy, and I have a full GUI-based editor, which you traditionally wouldn't get at the switch CLI, that takes all the contents and gives it it's a very easy to use policy builder, right? You have your class configuration for traffic matching, permit deny, all the traditional things you'd have to do at the CLI. And especially if you're not familiar with the Aruba switch, for example, all right here, you assign that to a policy, and essentially the switch grabs that in real time as it needs it for a policy to be applied. And the same thing can happen on the wireless side. And in the event that you actually wanted to say this laptop tunnel to a controller, the controller will pull down the same access policy, so you don't have to configure 9 different things, right? So very, very flexible.
So another way to look at it is you can go and provision your switches for their layer 1, layer 2, layer 3 connectivity, right? That just becomes a very simple template that's pushed out across the board. The security policy can all live within ClearPass, right? And as that evolves and needs to be changed, you never have to touch the switches again.
So I'm going to go ahead and plug the client we had before. This is hard with only one hand. Into the back of the phone, right? So this is a very typical enterprise deployment. And in this case, we should actually see the same client connect to the switch, but we will see it actually tunnel because we have a policy that says that all this client device, as you saw earlier, should tunnel. So let me actually take a look at the GUI. See if it authenticated yet. Oh, you know what? I disabled the wired NIC. That is why. Let me do that real quick. Disconnect from the wireless. And we should see that exact same policy applied, tunneled to the controller, whereas the switch is actually staying local. Client problems, let's see. Let's try one more time. Wouldn't be a demo without a client problem.
I didn't touch it this time.
I know. All right, there we go. Attempting to authenticate. In theory, this should go just like it did before.
There's a Mac joke here.
Yeah, there is. I know. I actually don't like Macs. I'm on one side. What? I know. Did we just lose our?
Here.
No, it's all right. I'm PC too,
I'm
Tim.
PC also.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. Beautiful.
We don't have these issues.
All right, so we had one client issue. Let's since we only have a couple minutes, let's flip over to the API demo real quick. It's not.
Can I ask
Nick
a-
is having some challenges.
Now, do you have
That's a
a
really
do you have
quick
Swagger
question.
interface or anything?
We do. It's right on every single ClearPass server.
Awesome.
Let me try and do this one in. This /API-docs.
No, it's good enough for me.
One more question here.
A really, really quick, probably not exactly related question. One thing that I've run into issues with is organizations have beautiful implementation, something goes wrong, and instant response team is called, and they have no documentation whatsoever. Does this have like a really nice like report-based thing where it can kind of give me a picture of the network?
Yeah, so we have it includes what we call the Insight module. That's going to give you a lot more pre-canned reports. We have the capability for our TAC can actually generate you a very custom report if you like it.
Really?
So they can kind of worry about where it's stored in the database and pull that information out for you. That's a service we provide free with TAC support.
Is there a way that you can like customize the reports?
Absolutely. So
Yeah.
each of them has essentially what I think we call it an executive overview version, and then you can actually customize, we call them columns, which extracts all that data out of the database. That could be things from authentication server to all the way to traditional posture checks. So there's a lot of templates built in, but you can also get custom ones created for free.
Lovely.
I think another example, a lot of customers have kind of asked us to continue to add a lot more support for SIMs, right? Splunk, QRadar, ArcSight, for example. So what they're doing is they're basically, they've got all these different devices in the network, and they're wanting to aggregate it all there. So we spend a lot of time, going ahead and making sure our syslog outputs basically match the right standards for those different vendors.
Oh, so when you plug into Splunk, it's through syslog?
Correct. So, for example, we actually do have a Splunk app. So,
you do? Okay.
so we've already created some customized dashboards and stuff that's specific for our product.
Oh, lovely.
And we are fully certified for Ceph and Leaf as well for any other platform. So.
Yeah, but I like Splunk, so that's okay.
Me too.
Tim, I know you want to jump to the API thing, and I know that we're running late. There's one thing you hadn't shown yet,
Yes.
which is on the application visibility.
Yes, I
So
didn't.
If you can just quickly show that, and then we'll jump to the APIs.
And that was API docs.
API
Slash
docs.
the root
Yeah, yeah.
FCN / API docs. Yep. And you will have to log in. It is
Dash docs?
API dash docs.
Dash docs.
Perfect.
So I did want to thank you for bringing this. This is one of the most important things. So as we saw on our contractor up there is on Netflix. This is an example of really aggregating all of the traffic information, destinations, application awareness, even things like we call it WebCC, so your traditional URL filtering, into one dashboard. And because we are taking the wired clients, wireless clients, and VPN and aggregating them into a single enforcement point, you have a complete dashboard here of what is going on in the network. So that Windows 10 client was actually streaming some, it just updated on me, was doing a bunch of web traffic, right? In this case, terrible example because it's not connected right now. Let's do that again. In this case, something syncing OneDrive, right? All of your application enforcement, Jabber on this case, and being able to essentially do application level restrictions from enforcing bandwidth restrictions, and those can happen on a per user, per AP, per building, any context you have, you can enforce that level of application, throttling and things and blocking altogether. Sure.
So with anything analytics, it's a big buzzword this year. What's the hit to the network on this?
So sure, on the controller itself.
Or is there any where you're using CPU cycles, you're using bandwidth?
Sure.
How does it negatively affect it to get this data?
Sure. So there is a DPI, engine, a hardware DPI engine in the controller. So visibility, there is absolutely no hit. I don't think we have specific numbers on enforcement, but we do have customers that use full enforcement on the controller. The controller does have a line rate firewall. So our largest controller is a 7280, which does 80 gigs of line rate firewall.
So this data is collected by MITM, not by the client?
So we do not do interception.
Okay.
So this is all essentially, for example, for identifying TLS traffic, we look at the certificate. We use a full DPI engine to look at the certificate, look at destinations, and then we have our WebCC engine, which does bright cloud style.
So you're just pulling DNS information for the website information?
That's one exactly. Yeah.
Almost like you guys planned to do this inside of the box.
What's that?
It's almost like you planned it. It's not an add-on.
Well, and to that point, right, so this is leveraging the firewall that has existed in Aruba wireless technologies for years, right? And this capability originally is still called AppRF. The difference is we've actually now extended to the wired. We're using either port-based or user-based to bring that wired traffic back to the controller. So kind of to your point, what's the impact for the user? Well, you're on our wireless right now, right? You're going through the exact same engine that we're demonstrating here. How is that any different from most wired clients, right? Most people say, well, I'm connecting at gig speed. But what's the reality of you actually connecting at gig speed, right? The truth is you're using a small percentage of that, such that running that traffic through the controller doesn't actually have a huge impact at all.
So you're actually supporting wired-based tunneling back to the controller as well?
Correct. That's exactly what he's
Exactly.
what
Essentially we do. So just one quick thing, right? So this is actually 8.4, which we'll be releasing imminently. That the dashboards were completely redesigned to take into account wired and wireless users as one entity for all intents and purposes. And essentially that is going back right to that 7005. Lowest end controller is doing all this DPI function as well.
So I apologize. They're trying to shepherd hook us.
So I just
we either do questions or you do the API. You got to pick.
I'll start doing the demo.
Okay.
I'm just curious how it scales. If you're doing both wired and wireless, is there a client max that you hit or have to now add a separate instance to?
So there are obviously limits because you are running to different types of controllers, but we have a full portfolio of different controller sizes. One of the things in AOS 8 was now the ability to cluster them, right? So we're actually able to get both greater scale as well as high availability for those wired applications. So you don't end up with a single point of failure for your wired users or your wireless.
Yeah, each of those wired users and each wireless user actually has a primary and a secondary controller all the time in the event of a failover, and they swing back and forth and they're actually load balanced across the cluster.
But that doesn't impact, say, the analysis portion? Like it's not going to be a limit of X number of devices.
And that was really the benefit of taking what we already had that people weren't necessarily maxing out, right? A lot of people order controllers for redundancy. They're not using the full capacity. The controllers have incredibly high, like 30,000 tunnel capacity, right, for the largest controllers. So I do want to hit the last demo. This is the API demo. This is something we built just as a quick kind of security operations demo, right? This person would have no access to ClearPath outside of this application via the API, authenticating using OAuth 2 and getting a specific access role, right? So we have some basic workflows. The one I just want to show real quick is we have an IoT device here that I want to quarantine. In this case, I'm just going to do it by, lost the MAC address. We just want to do it by MAC address. It could be found by IP address. Anything ClearPass knows about the session, which is a decent amount of information, you could actually isolate and find the session. And I'm just going to go ahead and click quarantine. And this will actually make a REST API call over to ClearPass. The endpoint was actually marked as compromised in this case. The port is being bounced as we speak, and when it comes back onto the network, it will be in a quarantine state. That quarantine state is actually going to be on the controller here, and we should actually see in a second when it comes back. So the port goes down for 12 seconds to allow it to read DHCP, and then we should see it come back up as a wired client in a quarantine state. Yes.
I had an earlier question about ClearPass, and I saw the ZSCALAR logo. Can you describe any integration you have with ZSCALAR? A lot of organizations still use pack files,
Sure.
but I think ZSCALAR wants GRE tunneling.
Yep.
to inspect more traffic? And what's your integration with Zscaler?
Yeah, so specifically on the policy side, one technology we have that is not unique to Zscaler is what we call Aruba Auto Sign-On. And that uses SAML-based authorization and authentication to essentially allow you, if I'm authenticated to the network as a .1x user, I've already proven my identity for that session. We can actually then pass that off to any other SAML-aware IDP service provider in that case, and essentially do a pass-through authentication. Right, so
Okay.
that a lot of it's around SAML and modern auth. And from the enforcement side, right, we can take advantage. The controllers as part of our SD-WAN architecture are really what work as part of the Zscaler solution.
You're not opening a GRE tunnel to like Zscaler?
No, not for those
authorizations.
The SD branch has a direct integration with Zscaler as part of a little bit different architecture.
So to that point, we're not an inline product, right? So ClearPass is sort of on that out of band communicating using Radius, using APIs and stuff like that. We're not on the data path, but as Tim pointed out, for like an SD branch application, which is basically a controller with some enhanced capabilities on it, that's where instances where you'd have the sort of GRE back to a Zscaler type thing.
So real quick, what is the wired tunneling capability into ClearPass that actually makes it tunnel back to the controller?
So ClearPass is out of band. We are literally speaking Radius to the switch, and the switch is essentially, we're instructing the switch to tunnel. So the switch then opens the communication channel to the controller.
That's
And just real quick, one demo worked. That's good. IoT quarantine, right? So that device is pumped to the controller in quarantine. So
Boom, done, right?
do we have one more question or while you're setting up? Or okay.
Real quick
Yeah, sure.
question. So your SecOps API supports quarantine. What other actions?
Yeah, real quick. And I do have to, it's been on my to-do list to get this on GitHub. I will do that over the Christmas break.
Okay.
So revoke and disconnect, right? A typical action.
Yep.
Register a device. Revoke certificates, right, which is a very common one now.
Yep.
Now that you're not using passwords, you need to revoke all the certs. So we will put this on our GitHub, github.com/Aruba. I will let Tom know when it's up.
And do you have a VPN demo?
We don't.
Publicly?
We didn't do the demo. We can, if you work with any Aruba engineer, we can do one remotely. But we just didn't have a chance to do it for this. We
could barely get
20
to
minutes.
pull this
Yeah, we
off.
barely got this.
Yeah. I just didn't know if there was one that everybody else could go see.
Yeah, so we have a lab that is open to partners and employees to do demos, so we could definitely figure something out there.
Are the
Thank you.
are the actions that are taken through those available workflows also sent to SIMs like Splunk and what have you?
They can be, right? So this dashboard does not do the direct send. You could say when ClearPass takes the action, send it off as well via syslog or an HTTP call.
And then are you able to still get granular details on what's happening or who's logged into this OPSEC to see who's quarantining or revoking access?
So this is literally, it's a very basic demo to show the API. It doesn't, it's not a productized, like it doesn't have logging or anything. It's just a visualization of the APIs. So it's skunkworks for all intents and purposes.
Gotcha.